We wanted to go ahead and start with the very latest out of Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in Ukraine, obviously. Since I left, been monitoring the news, don't you worry. The biggest one right now, President Biden is actually currently in the United Kingdom meeting with King Charles as we speak on his way to the NATO summit. At that NATO summit, there's going to be a lot of discussion around membership, which we'll get to. But the initial action that has been made before that summit was to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions. This was a big decision by the White House, as these are obviously considered a war crime or have been and been criticized by the United States previously, and was an indication about what the Ukrainian military wants and is requesting at this time. Here's what President Biden had to say.
We're in a situation where Ukraine continues to be brutally attacked across the board by munitions, by these cluster munitions that have dud rates that are very, very low, very high, that are a danger to civilians, number one. Number two, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. The ammunition that they call them 155 millimeter weapons. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it.
So there's a very key point that President Biden just made there, Krystal. Number one, the Ukrainians are running low on ammunition despite the $100 billion or so the United States provided to them. But number two, to me, is actually might be one of the most important one. We're running low on it, AKA we have provided them now with so much critical ammunition that the United States military is now so low on its stocks that we have to provide banned munitions to the Ukrainian military, which they have already used previously and actually were criticized by the New York Times and by some other human rights groups for doing so previously in this war.
Right.
This is a massive, massive sea change in the way that we are considering the amount of munitions that we provided to Ukraine. Previously, the line was, oh, guys, it's all surplus stocks, not stuff we were going to use. Anyway, then they did that fake devaluing of the equipment so they could provide even more. And despite the fake accounting gimmick, which is basically illegal, then the $100 billion or so of all of these munitions, we are now running so low, and they are also running so low, given their expenditures, both in the counteroffensive but also in Bakhmut, that they have now been begging for cluster munitions. There's also something that President Biden said there, which is a straight up lie. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. John Ismay, an excellent military reporter over at the New York Times. What does he note? The cluster munitions that the United States will provide to Ukraine is the 155 millimeter M864 projectile, which is loaded with 72 DPICM grenades that are identical to those used from the earlier M483 round. The dud rate on these submunitions has been observed at 14% in real-world conditions. Now, the Pentagon, in their statement justifying providing these weapons to Ukraine, Krystal, repeatedly said that the dud rate was some 2.35% or less, which is, quote, far better than the actual rate for common cluster munitions. So the Pentagon is straight up lying here. They're saying that the dud rate on these, which is what makes them so deadly to civilians, is much lower than the actual dud rate observed in real-world conditions, part of why we have been so reluctant to provide these weapons to Ukraine so much in the first place. And I should also note about hypocrisy. One of the consistent lines from the Obama administration throughout the slaughter of Aleppo and the Syrian civil war was that the Russians were using cluster munitions on civilian areas. Well, here's the issue, as we also criticize the Russians here for. All of Ukraine is a battlefield with civilians populated throughout it. So if the Ukrainians, by definition, are going to be using that, even on their own soil, they're putting many of their civilians at risk by using a known munition banned, by over 100 countries, considered a war crime by international organizations, and often criticized even by the United States military itself. I mean, this is something which really removes much of the, quote, moral high ground, as moral as the cause for Ukraine is, from America's stance in this war. Right?
Yeah, I mean, let's be really clear. This is an immoral act. It is truly an atrocity. I want people to understand in layman's terms what these things are. They're basically bombs that scatter a bunch of little grenades all around. And so when we're talking about the dud rate, the problem and why these have been banned by 100 countries that have signed on to the treaty, we are not a party to that treaty, neither is Russia, neither is Ukraine, but why so many countries, and why even so many of our allies, including the UK, who have been extremely hawkish, are criticizing this move, is because some percentage of those grenades do not detonate. That means that they are laying around in areas where frequently it's children that go and find them and they blow up and they kill them. There's varying numbers about what percent of civilians are killed by cluster bombs. New York Times cites a study that says it's 50% of the casualties from these bombs are civilians. There are other estimates that civilians represent up to 97% of cluster munition casualties. Again, disproportionately children are usually the ones that find these things laying around. So it is an immoral act, and it is clearly an act of desperation. Even the New York Times, Saagar, I was telling you before we started this morning, is reporting in very careful and couched words that the Ukrainian counteroffensive isn't going well. They haven't gained much ground. They've gained something like 60 square kilometers, which, pales in comparison to what they've been able to accomplish in the past. They really haven't been able to break through the Russian lines. You've got the Ukrainians running out of munitions. You've got us apparently running low. And so this is a desperate, immoral act that the Biden administration is perpetrating here. UK has criticized this action. Spain has criticized this action. Many of our allies have criticized this action. And, there have been some words of dissent from the progressives who should be clearly, unambiguously opposed to sending cluster bombs, which, again, considered a war crime by much of the world. But so far, we've heard very little. We did hear from Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who has been a clarion voice in many instances against endless wars. She was one of the lone voices to stand against the Iraq War authorization vote. Let's take a listen to a little bit of what she had to say.
Cluster bombs should never be used. That's crossing a line. Once you see what takes place, we know what takes place in terms of cluster bombs being very dangerous to civilians. They don't always immediately explode. Children can step on them. That's a line we should not cross.
So when Putin started using cluster bombs, the Biden White House said that would potentially be a war crime. Do you think that, therefore, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, will potentially be engaging in war crimes if this goes forward?
What I think is that we would risk losing our moral leadership, because when you look at the fact that over 120 countries have signed the convention on cluster munitions, saying they should never be used. They should never be used.
So she won't go so far as to call it a potential war crime, even though she should go that far. But that's a key question from Jake Tapper. Hey, when it was Russia using these things, y'all didn't have any qualms about calling it out for what it is. Now, the Biden administration, out of, desperation, and because Ukraine apparently always eventually gets what they want, they're going down the same path. But for some reason, when we do it, it's okay.
Yeah, and just to reiterate your point, this is not something that you do as a sign of strength, both from America's point of view and how destroyed our defense industrial base is, that we literally don't have enough munitions, apparently for ourselves, not only to provide, a regional war in Eastern Europe, but also for how the Ukrainians are doing. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. This is from Sky News over at the UK. Here's what they say, quote, U.S. cluster bombs deal is a clear signal the war is not going well for Ukraine. This is from Mark Stone. America risks losing the moral high ground by supplying Ukraine with a weapon banned by much of the world, so why are they supplying it? And as exactly you pointed to, Krystal, even the New York Times noting this in a very, very stark terms. Ukraine claims to have retaken 60 square miles. By comparison, the last great push in the fall reclaimed 5,000 square miles. Quote, they are probably weeks behind where it was hoped to be at this time. That is directly from the mouth of some of the most pro-Ukraine forces that exist in the U.S. media. Even Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, says, quote, it has been very hard going. Defense has consistently been a straightforward proposition than offense in this war, frankly, on both sides, fulfilling the World War I edict around when you lack air supremacy, combined air tactics and all that, well, defense is always going to be a much stronger position, and whenever you're attacking, you're going to lose a lot of men, and unfortunately, that's what's been happening to the Ukrainians. The cluster munitions and the bombs themselves are effectively showing you the same struggles that the World War I armies had, which is they also ran out of ammunition weeks into the war that they thought would last for forever. It ended up having massive expenditures. The United States and all those other countries that were fighting in World War I fortunately for them, had actual industrial bases that they could spin up. America is not a country at war. We're not going to a total war footing, and neither are any of the allies. Ukraine, of course, has zero industrial base. Actually, to speak of, they're 100% reliant. So what do you do then? Whenever you're running low and your allies and all of them, despite their extraordinary generosity, are depleting themselves so much that they also can't, spend even more money or go even more forward, you have to start reaching for desperate actions. And the cluster munitions, the reason that they are reaching for them is not only how deadly they are, but Krystal, we have a massive supply and stock of them. So it's one of the only other things that we still remain and have not tapped on Ukraine's behalf. So I think we can answer a couple of things. Number one, this is not going well for Ukraine, period, no matter what, given what they're asking for. It doesn't mean, though, that they can't still continue to do well. But number two is, in terms of the question, is this weakening the United States and its defense readiness? There's now zero question about this. There has always been a big debate about whether this was actually cannibalizing resources that we wouldn't use. It's out of the president's mouth now. Obviously, stockpiles are running low. You can't deny that. Now, there's some high-minded like, well, but we're fighting Russia, so it's worth every penny of it. And I'm like, yeah, but what if something breaks out right tomorrow in the South China Sea? What are we going to be doing? It's impossible, to predict. And then third, really, whenever it comes to the moral, strategy that we've been using on this, the Russians, and more importantly, I just returned from India, and I was telling you, there is a very different view of this conflict in the rest of the world. And now the Indians, the Brazilians, the Chinese, all these other people were like, yeah, well, you guys send them over cluster munitions. I'm like, and now if China wants to send deadly weapons to Russia, what are we going to say?
Yeah.
What are we supposed to say? They haven't even provided them anything. They're very willing to do so. News came out that President Xi spoke with Putin and said, hey, just don't use a nuke. All right, don't go. But, as long as Putin and Xi maintain good relations and let's say things start to look on the up and up for the Russian military, not outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
And then when we criticize Beijing, what are they going to throw right back in our face?
I mean, listen, let's tell the other side of it, which is that it's not like things have been going well for Russia lately either with their whole Prigozhin mutiny, whatever the hell happened there, which, we were just reporting this morning that apparently even after the attempted weird, pathetic coup thing, then Prigozhin had a meeting with Putin for 3 hours. No one's seen him since any of this happened. He was supposed to go to Belarus. Apparently, there's reports that he's still in Russia. Last understanding was that he was in St. Petersburg. So they got their own issues. Let's be clear about that. But Saagar, I think your point is a really important one, which is, listen, they just have to hold their line. And that's a lot easier to do than it is to push forward and break through those lines and be on the offense. They also have very clearly learned a lot from their early failures. They are better organized. They have better strategy and tactics in place, and it's being executed more effectively. So to me, all of this just underscores why it is so imperative that this war be brought to a close as soon as possible, that the parties are able to get to the negotiating table, that the U.S. do everything in our power, and we have a lot, in order to force some sort of negotiations and ultimately negotiated settlement. Because, the war of attrition that we've been warning about and so many military analysts have been warning about is effectively upon us. And, Russia does have a large industrial base. They are on war footing. We are not. We are running low. And now we are resorting to the desperate tactics. It's funny because, Saagar, we talked so much about Russia resorting to these desperate tactics, and they have in many instances, and the type of, dirty and horrific things that they would pull out of their bag of tricks when they're backed into a corner. And now here we are, actually the ones sending cluster bombs into this fight out of our own desperation. So it is a grotesque outcome here from the Biden administration and is clearly indefensible.
Well, the problem, too, for Ukraine is, the people you're killing as a result of these, not just Russian soldiers. I mean, many of these people are your own civilians, your own citizens, ostensibly, who you're
Ukrainian kids.
It's Ukrainian children who you're fighting to take over. And, I don't want to downplay either what the long legacy of these things. I've been to Cambodia. I've seen a lot of people who got their legs blown off by just wandering around in fields. In fact, in many areas that I visited in Cambodia, they're like, do not step off this road or like you literally could die.
Yeah.
And that was, in the 2000s, decades after the conflict. So the long-lasting legacy of these is a total disaster and is really one where this is going to devastate this part of Ukraine now for a long time, even more so than it already is, and really muddies the waters and makes it more complicated. Just reiterating the call to try and end this thing as soon as humanly possible.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.